Colonel Don Edmonds, retired United States Air Force, from Knoxville, currently lives in Von Orr, married to the former Mary Hodges. UT Logistics Transportation, General Business, both degrees. His last assignment was November 1998, the commander for the 702 Computer Systems Squadron and director for NORAD, Systems Support Facility, Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. Retired October 1st, 2003. Donald, you got it, buddy.
Can we turn this right here?
Yeah.
Try to get over in the corner out of the way. I build these things no notes, but I build them because that's my notes. I'm going to talk to you today about 9/11. Well, it didn't work. And it worked before when I tried it. Is the sound on back there? Because I've ran it when we started, when you weren't here, and it ran. Let me go back and try again.
Attention all aircraft monitoring Andrews Tower frequencies. Andrews and Class Bravo airspace is closed. No general aviation aircraft are permitted to enter Class Bravo airspace. Any infractions will be shot down.
That was broadcast by the Andrews Air Force Base Tower during the attack on 9/11. And it covered Class Bravo, which is Washington, D.C. I don't think anybody in this room ever thought that we would hear those words over our nation's capital. And by the way, you'll see many things said about where those words came from. They came from Dick Cheney. I saw it come over the wire myself. These two items. The commander of 1st Air Force, who's responsible for air defense on 9/11, is Larry Arnold. That was my boss. And I'll tell you a story about General Arnold. After we had both retired, he was called to Congress to testify about what happened. And he said to me, I ran across him, he pulled me aside and says, Don, I want to tell you a story. He said, this congressman up there kept grilling me, and he wanted to know why we weren't prepared for planes flying into buildings. And I said, sir, my staff and I sat down and thought of every scenario we could think of, and we didn't think of that one. And the congressman replied, General, you had a failure of imagination. And that came from our congressional people. What I'm fixing to show you is an Air Force briefing that the Congress directed 1st Air Force to put together and to brief them on what happened. General Arnold told us after we were doing this, you take this briefing and show everybody you can because everybody needs to know what happened. Warfare changed on 9/11. Up until 9/11, warfare was traditional and symmetric, simply meaning when we went after Germany in World War II, where was Hitler and what was the nation state? We went after Saddam, where's Saddam and what's the nation state? You go after Osama, where's the nation state? Where's he hiding? Or the Taliban or ISIL? You see the problem. It is now complex and asymmetric. And it presents a big problem for your military trying to fight a war under these conditions. The North American Air Defense Command has not gone away. Following the implosion of the Soviet Union, air defense shrunk dramatically, and the Air Force gave it over to the Air National Guard and said, we're out of the business. Now they wish they were back in it. NORAD's mission on the morning of 9/11 is aerospace warning. They're supposed to identify breathing, air breathing, manned and unmanned vehicles coming towards the U.S. to attack us. That's their mission, and respond to it. The architecture of our air defense system looks like this. It's not showing on the Alaska NORAD region in Alaska is run by the Alaska Air National Guard. The Canadian NORAD region, which is divided into east and west, and the Continental NORAD region, which has a western sector run by the Washington State Air National Guard, a northeast sector run by the New York Air National Guard, and a southeast sector run by the Florida Air National Guard. Okay, I'm going to show you what happened step by step on 9/11. If you had looked at a radar that morning of the United States, this is what it would have looked like. There's planes on top of planes on top of planes. The Joint Chiefs of Staff hijack policy on 9/11, and let me tell you up front, it has changed, and you'll see why. FAA had responsibility for hijack, military not involved. If they needed help, they would go to the NMCC in the Pentagon and ask for help. Who would go to the commander of NORAD at Colorado Springs and see if they had assets to help? Who would go out to the units and find if there was assets, and if there was, then they'd go to the Secretary of Defense basically for permission to help the FAA. You see where I'm going, folks? You can't get there from here. We're already flying into buildings before we can make a decision. Ain't that way today, I promise you. It is that quick today if FAA needs help. This is going to be the tracking, and let me show you a couple of things. First, everything took place. You see Needs in the upper part there, Rome, New York. Everything took place in their operational area. The 84th Radar Evaluation Squadron, which we call RAIDS for short, has a responsibility in the Air Force of breaking out computer tapes of radar returns. So this will make sense to you in a minute, but like you tape at home to watch a movie, you can take a tape of a radar to them and they can run it again and analyze it and figure out why two planes ran together and crashed or something. All of this that I'm showing you comes from the RAID squadron. There's F-15s on alert up at Cape Cod. There's F-16s on alert down here in Virginia. Okay, you're going to start to see tracks here, and the tracks are color-coded. The first track is American 11 coming out of Boston, and you see the solid yellow line. Now let me explain something here, and I'm going to talk about more about this. The radar in the United States are not hooked into the FAA or the military system. The only radars in our system are looking out for the Russian Bear bomber. And so on the morning of 9/11, we had no way to see the bad guy or the airplanes they hijacked. Now when you see the solid yellow line, for instance, on Flight A, American 11, that means when the radar tape was broken out by raids, they could track the plane continuously. When you see dots of yellow, that means intermittently they could see the plane. And when you see white dots, that means they're guessing where the airplane was. So you see here, at 8:02, we get 11 out of Boston taking off. At 8:16, we get United 175 out of Boston. And then at 8:19, we get American 77 out of Dulles taking off. 3 of the hijacked planes, 3 big airplanes full of fuel, all headed west. First indication of a problem is a transponder is turned off in Flight 11. Now the transponder is a radio in a cockpit. And when a pilot goes to fly, I'll call it a mission, he puts in a code, and that code is transmitted to the FAA and shows up on their screen. Now we all see in the movies the radar thing going around and the blip on there. That isn't what we look at anymore. We've all got square computer screens, and it shows up on the screen as a little square at the FAA, and he moves his mouse around and clicks on that square, and it opens up and says here's speed, altitude, direction, the whole bit of that airplane. The hijackers were smart enough that when they flipped that radio off, we were blind. We could not see those airplanes. Understand that. We were doing this. We could not see those airplanes. It was a guess where they were. Now, I want you to start seeing the fog of war here, because you've got people trying to make decisions, and the inputs you're getting are coming, and they're not coming in a timely manner. At 20 minutes after the hijack, the FAA tells us that there's a possible hijack. And we're down at the Air Defense Center at Tyndall Air Force Base. We put the F-15s on alert up at Cape Cod. We put them on what we call battle stations, and what that means is the pilots get in the airplane, they got the finger on the start button, all the crew standing around ready to yank the chocks and launch them. It's a lean forward kind of thing. 175 and 77 are on course. And the last plane, 93, comes out of Newark, headed west. The Selfridge Air Force Base, which is at Detroit, you see it up here kind of to the left, had some F-16s that morning take off, and they were going up upper part of lower Michigan to do some training. And we tried to grab them to come down and look for 77 and 93, but they didn't have enough fuel. We couldn't get them. At 46, we decided to scramble the F-15s at Cape Cod. Now this is why you have generals and colonels and stuff. And those of you that are private said the colonel did nothing to sit behind the desk all day. You're paying for experience, and that's why they launch the airplane. Something's not right. Let's put the planes in the air. The captain might have sat around and said, "Well, let's wait and see if something happens before we do anything." Experience. Again, in here 11, the yellow dots and dashes, they shows the last radar return near the World Trade Center, and then it crashes in the World Trade Center at 8:46. The planes have taken off at Cape Cod. They're 153 miles away, will not be a factor. FAA tells us that, excuse me, I skipped one. At 8:46, American 11 impacts the tower. At 11 minutes later, the FAA tells us that a plane has impacted the tower. Now let me tell you one of several happenstances, one that happened that day. The Air Operations Center at Tyndall Air Force Base was full up in an exercise. Now normally there's about 4 or 5 sergeants and a captain or something who work in that center. But during the wartime, you fleshed out with generals and colonels and captains and so forth, bunches of people. They're all there in the seat because they're in the middle of an exercise. So when this thing goes down, General Arnold, who's sitting at the top, says, "Real world." And we all know that in the military. When you say real world, it means we ain't playing games anymore, man. It's pull the trigger time. So everybody immediately goes with it. A happenstance, it was good for us because we had everybody there. We didn't have to call people to work or anything. Here's something that blew me away when I first heard it. When the first plane flew in the World Trade Center, a message was passed into the Joint Chiefs of Staff who were in a meeting, telling them. And the first word said in that room was Osama bin Laden. And I said, how in the heck did they know? I sat in classified briefings. I'd never heard anything about Osama. And how in the world did they know that? Well, we had a general come through Tyndall sometime after that to get this briefing. And he was talking to us, and he said that they had been watching Osama bin Laden. He was on their radar. He had the money, the wherewithal, the people to hurt us, and he wanted to. And they kind of were aware of him. And when this happened, they said that because he was the only one in the world they knew that had the capability to do this. I was at my desk. Now, my job is commander of a software unit, and we wrote and updated and so forth software for the air defense system that I showed you on that earlier slide. And so when this comes down, I no longer have a job because y'all have computers at home. If you want a computer to work, quit loading programs and doing things, right? Well, that's what they told us to do. But anyway, my wife called me and says a plane flew into a building in New York. And so I said, okay, and I walked across the hall to where TV was, expecting to see a foggy day, and it was clear, and I'm standing there thinking, how could that happen? And then I saw basically this picture right here of the second airplane. And I said, like we all did, you know, something's up here, this isn't right. And I went back and got my line badge, my secure badge, and went down to the Air Operations Center. And the Air Operations Center is built kind of like a football stadium. You know, there's General Arnold's up the top, and it steps all the way down with desks and positions and computers, and all around the room are screens that tell you information. And at the top all around the room are TV sets, and there's ABC and CBS and etc. And they're not there to watch the soap opera. We get intelligence quicker through the media than we do through our own sources in the military. How quick did we see that plane flying at Trade Center? We saw the second one in real time. How quick did our sources, you'll see here how quick the FAA told us. We saw it real time on TV by the second. United 175 impacts the South Tower at 9:03. The fighters coming out of Cape Cod at this point are still 8 minutes away. They will not be a factor. FAA tells us that 175's hijacked, and then 8 minutes after we saw it on TV, they tell us it ran into the South Tower. You start to see the lag time here. 77's flying west. Talk about President Bush for a minute. He was down in Sarasota, Florida. He was speaking to a classroom of kids, and Andy Card, I believe that's the guy's name, walked up to him and whispered in his ear about what's going on. And at first he decided not to do anything, didn't want to create any panic or anything, so he went ahead doing what he's doing. And then he excused himself and said, we've got to run, and they went out to the airport. And of course, the time they got to the airport, the Air Force colonel that commands Air Force One had everything cranked up, ready to go. And as soon as they got Bush on there, they took off immediately. Get out of town. Now let me tell you what they did. They took off out of, darn it, I can't use this thing. They took off out of Sarasota, Florida, going north. They're going to Washington, D.C. But they talked to Cheney and the folks in the White House are in the bunker, and they tell them, do not come to Washington. We don't have control over things. Things are going to heck in a handbag here. So they do a left turn and go to Barksdale Air Force Base over in Louisiana. And they go in fast and hot. You know when you land in the airliner and it comes down and comes. No, man, they went in like that and hit the runway and slammed on the brakes. The president jumped in the vehicle, ran over to base ops, and one of the comical things that happened, he walked in the office of the base commander, Colonel, sitting there, didn't even know the president's anywhere around, and walked up to his desk and said, Colonel, mind if I borrow your phone? They decide that that's not a safe place for the president, and they moved to Omaha, Nebraska. That's a home of SAC, and they have underground bunkers and all kinds of protections, so they moved the president up to Offutt and keep him there until they determine it's safe to bring him back to D.C. At this point, at 9:09, we put the F-16s down at Langley Air Force Base on Battle Station because we may have launched them. Now, tracking the raids coverage now, you see down here the red, 77's gone out. Now he's turned around and he's coming back towards Washington, towards D.C. FAA reports a possible hijack on 93 now. They tell us possible hijack on 77. We scramble the F-16s down here at Langley. Then we get a report that there's a fifth airplane missing, Delta 89. And I remember, and let me tell you what I did that day. I didn't finish that thought. I went up on the top of the Air Operations Center where General Arnold and the Canadian General Bullard was and Colonel, and I stood right behind General Arnold because I no longer had a job, and because I could do things for him, and I stood right there. I could have reached out and touched him, and I stood there all morning in case he needed something. He could turn around and grab me and say, go do so-and-so. and that never happened. But I'm telling you that because I was a fly on the wall and watched all of this happen. And I remember when they called in on 89, I remember the guy writing it on the board and said, "Oh Lord, here's a fifth one now. How many are there?" The F-15s arrive over New York and establish a combat air patrol 24/7 over New York, which lasted about 13 months, I think. And since then, they do it intermittently, so you never know when they're up there. And of course, we don't want the bad guy to ever know when they're up there. The F-16s out of Langley, out of Virginia, get off the ground. At that point, they're 12 minutes from Washington, D.C. The FAA tells us they're unable to locate 77. Gopher 6 is an interesting story. I'll jump over here. Gopher 6 is a C-130 out of the Minnesota Air National Guard. He's at Andrews Air Force Base, and that morning the crew has gone out to the plane, prep the plane, and fly back to Minnesota. Because they're out on the runway, they don't know anything's going on. They're oblivious to what's happening. They get ready to go, and they take off, and they're heading out, and they're coming out of Andrews. And Andrews, by the way, if you look at a clock of DC, it'd be 5 o'clock on the Beltway. It's where Andrews Air Force Base is. And when you take off heading on the runway going towards Washington, as soon as you get off the ground, the whole Washington is laid out before you. Now, he took off going west the other way, and he hadn't been off long, and he called a tower and said there was a heavy, going fast low just past under me. He's talking about 77. They saw 77 fly under them. They flew on out and passed over and saw where 93 crashed. This plane did. The F-16s at 9:35 are reported airborne. We get the last data at 9:37 on 77. 93, the transponder's now cut off on that one, so we're sure it's a hijack. 77 impacts the Pentagon. FAA reports to us 89 is a possible hijack. Talk about the plane hitting the Pentagon. When 77 came into DC, it did a 360-degree around town and then flew into the Pentagon. And there's a lot of speculation why he did that. I kind of think that he was looking for the White House, because if you look at Washington, D.C. from the air, the one building in town that's hard to see is the White House. You can see the Capitol. You can see the Department of Defense, Pentagon, but the White House kind of blends in. It's not that big a building compared to the rest of it. But anyway, he flew into the Pentagon. Another happenstance here. He flew in, coming from this direction. The Pentagon's like 5 pieces of pie, so to speak. They are remodeling that building. It was built in World War II really in a hurry, and it has never been that great a building, and now they're redoing it. And I think each one of those slices of pie cost $1 billion, if I got it right. But anyway, they had finished one, and guess which one they flew into? And you say, oh shucks, there went $1 billion. Oh shucks, it saved a whole bunch of lives, because we had fire doors, fire suppression systems, all kinds of security things the rest of the Pentagon didn't have. And they'd hit any other part of the Pentagon, the loss of life would have been far higher. Senator Bill Nelson came, and many, many people came to Tyndall, and I sat in briefings with them, and they told their story, what happened, and we gave them this briefing. But Senator Nelson said he was in the Capitol, and they're watching the TV like everybody else, and he said all of a sudden word went out, get out now. And he said, ran down the hall, out the back steps, down in the parking lot, saw another senator driving off in a car, jumped in it with him, and we went up to northern D.C. and hid behind the gas station and listened to it on the radio. He said, we're scared to death. We didn't know what was going to happen next. And the FAA had said that 77 is coming back towards town, and I think that's probably the point that they told people in the Capitol to get out of the Capitol. You see 93 fades from Detroit radar. Now they got a Detroit radar that Rage is looking at, and you're going into the dots again. 89 lands in Cleveland, and we know now it's not a hijack. And I remember that, they were racing it off the board, right over to my right. Took it off the board. Now we're getting help. The 101st Air Control Squadron has a radar, what they call tactical radar, set up in the field. They call us up and say, we're churning and burning. What can we do to help? We get the last radar at 10:02 on 93, and at 10:03 it crashes into the ground. And we know that almost immediately again by TV. The fighters are about 11 minutes away, so they'll not be any good in that scenario. Dang, I jumped a bunch of them. Okay, the F-16s land up at Selfridge, Detroit. We weren't able to use those. FAA tells us there's a bomb on UAL 93. Then FAA reports to it crashed 12 minutes after we knew about it. Gopher 6, we were talking about the C-130, lands in Youngstown, Ohio, because they put all the planes on the ground. Toledo comes up and calls us. Says, we got a radar. What do you want us to look for? Syracuse at 10:44 comes up. We got F-16s airborne. What do you want us to do? And the rest of the morning, it just flooded like that all over the country. Units calling up and saying, we can help. What do you want us to do? And of course, you and I now know now, and we didn't know then, it's over with. Well, this thing, excuse me. That is Operation Noble Eagle. That's what happened that morning. And we call it in the military one, Operation Noble Eagle. But let's talk just a minute about what transpired since then. On the morning of 9/11, we had 7 sites with 14 airplanes sitting alert. In my father's day, he was in air defense. There was 250,000 people and 250,000 people and 5,000 airplanes dedicated to air defense. And on 9/11, that was it. That's all we had. It was considered no threat. 18 hours later, that's what it looks like, and it looks a lot like that today. And you'll even see there's the blue dots is Navy carrier battle groups that we had tied into our system by the end of that day to help us on the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf. People coming across the Atlantic Ocean that had gotten halfway couldn't go back, and we told them they couldn't land here, had to go somewhere, and they went into Canada, and there's the runway at Gander with them stacked up, the runway down there at Halifax with them stacked up. A little known fact, there's more people in airplanes on the runway at Gander than there is in the town of Gander. The Canadians came out and did wonderful. You just absolutely fed people, brought them blankets, whole bit. How did the FAA get the planes on the ground quick? All my years in the Air Force, I've never heard this. I learned something. They've got a code word, they call it SATANA. SATANA stands for Plan for the Security Control of Aviation Traffic and Air Navigation Aids. And when a pilot hears that word SATANA, they know, get out your map and find the nearest runway and get on the ground, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Our alert posture is far higher. We used to have just fighters. They'd go up for an hour and a half, be out of fuel, have to come back. Now we got tankers. And let me give you an example of what we do nowadays. You'll see Jacksonville and Knoxville. Okay, Jacksonville has F-15s. Let's say they put a couple of F-15s over Atlanta on a football weekend, and we put a tanker up there out of Knoxville with it. They can step there all day long. And why would we do that? That's how we cover it now. Football weekend, what we got? Game at Knoxville, game at Tuscaloosa, maybe one in Atlanta, down at Gainesville. What these guys can do in those F-15s, they can make a dash. If there's a problem, they can pour on the coals. They're already airborne. They can make a dash to go help anywhere in the southeast. So you see how we handle it now, how we're prepared to handle it. Air surveillance. You remember we had no inside look in the United States. Now we've got fixed radar assets. We have air surveillance through AWACS and Navy AWACS. And an AWACS airplane with a radar up at 30,000 feet can see a heck of a lot further than one can on the ground. the Joint Surveillance System now. We've got fixed radars, ARSA radars. We have the Aerostat radars in that, and I worked with those at Tyndall, but that looks like a blimp with a radar package on it and nobody on it, and it goes, I call it, go up on a string to 10,000 foot, and you got look down capability so nobody can fly under radar. And see where all those are on our southern border. That's to keep the druggies from coming in, but that's tied in the system now. Evolving challenges. Well, we've got a lot of things to protect. Population centers, nuclear sites, Olympics, the president, and so forth. And so that's what we're trying to do nowadays in air defense. And folks, that is 9/11 and what happened in that couple of hours there that morning. And I have about 15 more minutes of stories I yanked out of this so I could stay in 30 minutes. So if you want to stay afterwards, I'll cover that.
You got time. A couple of questions, maybe, real quick. Go back to John.
Okay. Yes, sir.
How you gonna handle drones?
Look, drones came along after I was in the service, so I don't know what the rules of engagement are with drones. I won't make anything up. I'll just plain tell you I don't know.
We better get ready for them, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Some time ago, a week ago maybe, there was a report that a Russian plane had flown over. They got into airspace. You know anything about that?
Well, the Russians do that all the time, and we do the same things. And I could tell you stories, but they're classified. But I remember when I was in Alaska, stationed in Alaska, they found a Russian Bear bomber coming out of Alaska, not going in. So, you know, that's what they do. And what they do is they fly and see where our radar is. That's what they're doing. They're flying down the coast. They got electronics, and they can tell when they're returning radar signature, and they fly down through there, and they're looking for holes in it or places. And that's what they're doing. And we do the same thing to them. But, you know, it isn't a one-sided thing. Yes, sir.
I hope this doesn't sound too critical, but it seems like we were terribly unprepared for this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll admit it. Yeah, we were.
That's beyond comprehension. We are now apparently more prepared.
Yes. Who in this room thought they'd fly planes into buildings? I mean, that was something nobody thought about. We're dealing with a very smart enemy. You can call them ragheads or anything, but buddy, they're pretty darn smart.
Last question.
Yes.
If you had known beforehand that this was going to happen, and we had to take the ultimate decision and shoot these planes down, I know y'all probably played these scenarios in your heads and whatever. What would you think the public's reaction would have been? I mean, I know people would try to spin that, twist it.
Absolutely they would, but if your air defense mission shoots the plane down, they're going to shoot it down. You know, unfortunate that they're going to do what they're supposed to do.
In this case, they would have had to. If they knew
Yeah,
what was going to
absolutely.
happen, they would have had
The
to.
pilots were prepared to do that, and if you stay for afterwards, I'll talk about that.
Colonel,
Thank you.
here's a thank you very much.